Good afternoon. We're at the University of Notre Dame on September 27th, 2023, and I'm with the poet Luivette Resto. Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Luivette.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
So to get us started, could you share with our audience, first of all, your full name, where you were born and raised, and then offer us a vivid portrait of your childhood, and you can interpret that term however you want, maybe from Aguas Buenas, but also the Bronx,
Right.
to give us a sense of the place where you grew up.
Well, my full name is Luivette Resto Garcia. That's what it says on my birth certificate. But they cut off the Garcia when I got to the States. And I was born in Aguas Buenas, Puerto Rico. Was there for about 5 years, almost 5 years. And then the family completely moved over to the Bronx at that point in time when I was about 5. And the Bronx is all I knew until I went to Ithaca for college, and when I went to Cornell. And then eventually graduate school in Massachusetts, and then for the past 20 years I've been living in Los Angeles.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, when you say Aguas Buenas, one of the things that comes to mind are other poets. I think Victor Hernandez Cruz was born in Aguas Buenas. So you said your first 5 years when Aguas Buenas. Is there one, could you offer us a scene or a snippet of your childhood that might still remain vivid in your memory from those first 5 years?
Oh, absolutely. The memories that I have a few, but I have one of the memories, which is I was trying to skateboard, right? I was trying to skateboard, and I remember my mom didn't want me to do it, but I still did it anyway. And I had there's a picture of it, a blue skateboard with like some stripes on it, and I was going down, and I really believed I could do this. And then I actually was sitting on the skateboard, and then I put my hands down, and I actually rolled over my thumb. And I remember, and I have that memory of like rolling over my thumb, and I'm like, screaming and crying, and then, having, this little bloody thumb, unfortunately. But I have that memory of being in Puerto Rico when that happened, and getting my dog. I got a dog when I was like 3 or 4 years old, and it happened in Puerto Rico, so I got this little collie, whatever.
What was the flora and fauna of Aguas Buenas? I mean, think of Aguas Buenas versus, say, San Juan. What was the flora and fauna?
Well, Aguas Buenas is next to Caguas. So for people who may know, the name Aguas Buenas, I think, is misleading to a lot of people because they may think like I'm right by the ocean or right by, on the beach, and I'm not. Aguas Buenas is coming from the rivers. So Aguas Buenas is more in the mountains, right? So you have to kind of like, meander up to Aguas Buenas, and it's kind of like nestled in the mountains. So it's pretty like hilly to get to Aguas Buenas. Like that definitely is lodged in my memory of like the windy roads and getting a little car sick or bus sick, with being in the van and just like, okay, not to look, and you follow that little rule. So for the memories that I have, it's just greenery, because you're trying to go up the montaña. And then once you're there, to me, it's like all of a sudden this town shows up to a certain extent, right? But it's small, and we're just surrounded by, mountainsides, hillsides, and lots of trees. It's really common to see like caballos, like, just roaming. People are still, at the time, we're still on horses, just, getting around. I mean, they had cars, but, riding a horse, even to this day, is not really uncommon. Aguas Buenas is, again, very much a little mountain kind of town.
And what was the context and circumstances of your family deciding to make the move to the Bronx?
Well, my abuela already had been living what I think now, knowing what I know now of Puerto Ricans and migration, a very, very typical situation where he was 50% on the island and 50% in New York. He, at the time it was like $50 round trip on American Airlines to move back and forth. So he moved to New York City. I think he had some friends there, and he was working bodegas, essentially. He was working with some people at bodegas, eventually learned the business, and I think he was able to, again, this is what I'm piecing together from the little bit of investigation I can do about my family, is that he was able to accrue some money to then buy his own bodega, right? He had his own bodega, and then he was able to accrue, and I guess he was doing really well, that he made enough money to buy his own apartment building. So it was like a 3-floor and a basement level apartment building in the South Bronx, off the Cross Bronx Expressway, exit 4. And I think that once the money was coming in, that's when he made the phone call and said, you know what, I got us a place, we have some stability, I'm not going to keep going back and forth, I think everyone should be here. My aunt already had moved to New York to help him out with the bodega after she dropped out of college. He's like, well, you know, let's make you functional, right? And said, come up here and help me out. So she already had been living in the States. We already had some family living in New Jersey. His sister lived in New Jersey with her family. So there was already some of us already out there. The ones that stayed behind were myself, my mother, and my grandmother, and then extended family. And then eventually, like when he was able to have the apartment building, I said, okay, we have a place to stay. Everybody can come up. And so my grandmother and I went first, and then my mother stayed behind, I think, to maybe just like, I think to just wrap up any like, you know, financial affairs we had. And then a few months later, she came to New York, or she came to the Bronx.
Okay. And so then could you share with us a little bit about, so if you were 5 when you arrived at the Bronx, you weren't yet quite first grade age.
Right now.
So talk to us a little bit about your education, so say from 5 to 12, 13, basically elementary school.
Right, and in New York City, they call it elementary school. So we don't call it junior high or anything. There's no junior high. It's like either K through 8, and that was it. And so I was raised a Catholic. My grandmother's a diehard Catholic. So as soon as we landed, it was like, you got to go to Catholic school. And her brother also had been living in the Bronx. So she had another brother, and so his home was not that far from this the school called St. Anthony's, which already shut down, unfortunately. And so that's what she knew. And it was really far from where we were living, actually. It was it was 2 buses, honestly, to get to that space. But that's what she knew, and that's what she trusted, and it was Catholic. So she matriculated me there. It wasn't successful because I couldn't speak English. So when I came to this country, not having any sense of the language, I didn't do well during the interview. The principal, Sister Catherine, said, you know, she's great, but she doesn't speak the language. And my grandmother, being who she is and who she was really at the time, very tenacious and just a huge advocate of me, and was just like, no, but she's really smart, right? She knows her alphabet, she knows her colors, she knows her numbers, which was all true. I was at a preschool. I was put into preschool at the age of like 2 or 3, so I knew the basics. It just was in a different language, essentially. And so she really, really pushed. And because of my grandmother's, my abuela's like tenacity and just like advocacy for me and her belief in who I was and what I was capable of, Sister Catherine gave in, and I was allowed to go into kindergarten, but not knowing the language at all, and having to now all of a sudden survive in kindergarten without the language, and just making out a little bit what the teacher was saying by hand motions and whatever she drew on the board, and then also, again, interesting enough that problem solving kicks in even at a young age, and I sat next to 2 girls who can translate for me, and they were my translators for a whole year. And I'm still friends with them to this day, like, you know, over social media. So I'm still connected to them even to this day, Becky and Vanessa. But they were my Puerto Ricanas as well, and they sat next to me, and they translated for me for almost a year.
So the language of instruction was in English?
Yeah, everything was in English. There was no
immersion. So it wasn't like a dual language, bilingual? There
was none of that at the time. This was like the early 80s, and none of that was happening. It was again, looking back on it, it was a very traditional Catholic school.
So what was that experience of suddenly having to navigate and explore the English language in that setting?
It was, again, at the time, I'm assuming I was really nervous and things like that. And there was definitely moments, memories that I have of, I think the most vivid memory, and I have written about it a few times, is that Miss Farrell, she was a sweet lady with like a Dorothy Hamill haircut, for the people who know who Dorothy Hamill is. But she was writing on the board about the seasons. I think that's what she was talking about. And she drew this beautiful, elaborate tree. And she used regular chalk, because it was chalkboard, and she used color chalk to really showcase the leaves. And she was talking about the leaves changing, because she drew the leaves in different colors, like in orange and in red. And then that's what she was referring to. And I was able to kind of figure out that she's talking about seasons. And so I remember going up to her during a break that she gave us, like maybe it was a bathroom break, or like, we're gonna color break. And I went to her and I said, in the best way that I could, I go, the tree. I just said tree, shake, and leaves. And she was able to understand me, that I knew what she was what she was trying to teach. And I have that image in my brain. And she was the sweetest woman. She had a lot of patience for me. And the way that I was able to learn English was, I remember being on the buses, like the 2 buses that my abuela and I would take, and I would read the storefronts. The number 42 bus was the main bus that we took, and it was the longest, and it basically took us through the artery. One of the main arteries in the Bronx is Tremont Avenue. And just being on that long, we were on the bus for easily a half hour. And just like anytime the bus would stop, I would read the storefronts. And I would ask my grandmother, who did speak English pretty well, I would say, it says good food. I remember saying that out loud to her, like, good food? And she goes, yes, good food. And I would try to say the storefronts, and watched a lot of television, honestly.
Oh, that was my next question. So would television play a role?
Oh, it's a huge role.
Language acquisition?
Yeah, because I was an only child. I am an only child. And I'm definitely a product of the 80s, where the television was your babysitter, for people who, a lot of us experienced that. And my mom worked. My mom worked a 9-to-5 job, so she was not going to get home till after 5. And my abuela was taking care of taking care of the household or something. So, or she was watching her own programas, right? She was watching Univision, whatever she wanted to watch. So I watched a lot of television, and I watched a lot of I Love Lucy reruns, and that's where I think my love of comedy came from. I watched a lot of I Love Lucy. I watched a lot of soap operas. I watched,
One Life to Live or telenovelas?
No, it was Days of Our Lives. It really was. I watched Days of Our Lives religiously as a child, even from kindergarten all the way to high school. And I know for a fact that watching Days of Our Lives as a kindergartner helped me learn English, because I would watch it and we would record it. Like, we set the VCR to 1 p.m. and I would watch the recording of it when I would get home. And no one questioned this. They should have. I was like 5 or 6 watching this, a very campy soap opera, but where people were in a coma half the time, and people, it was a soap opera, and that's really how I learned, like watching television a lot, cartoons, and
Did there come a time when you eventually began to acquire the language and reading knowledge of the language? Do you have an early memory or a first memory of when you discovered the universe of books?
Definitely became, once I, got a hold of it or started to understand phonetics, right, phonics, because they were teaching us phonics in first grade, and they don't do that anymore really, but phonics was a class. Once I really wrapped my head around that PH is a, F sound and ST is this, and that's when really things started to open up. And I got glasses, because they discovered I needed glasses in first grade. I couldn't see the board. So all of this could have played a factor into why. But once all that came together, I have vivid memories of going to the public library and asking for the maximum amount of books you can take out at one shot. At the time, I don't think there's a limit anymore, but at the time you couldn't only take out 15 books. It was a cap of 15 books, and I would check out 15 books.
Are we talking second grade, third grade?
Third grade, fourth grade. I'm talking all the way to 8th grade, 7th grade.
Okay.
I would go to the public libraries in the Bronx. Parkchester was a big one for us. Arthur Avenue, Little Italy. It's another place we used to go to. There's a public library there. And I would check out 15 books, whatever the max was. And at first, my family didn't believe I was going to read all these books. They say that to this day. They were like, oh, she's not going to finish these. And I literally would devour all those 15 books. I mean, they were Judy Blume books. They were Buster Brown was one of my favorite. I didn't care for like Nancy Drew, but I loved Buster Brown. And so Encyclopedia Brown, there you go. Encyclopedia Brown. And so it was those kind of books. And then eventually it was like Sweet Valley High books and Babysitter's Club and that kind of stuff. But I would check out 15 at a time and finish them within like a week or maybe 2 weeks. And then I would get another 15. And
how did that eventually lead to perhaps discovering, experiencing a poem?
I didn't discover poetry, honestly, till I was in high school.
Okay, tell us.
It wasn't to high school. It was probably, I want to say it was my senior year.
Okay.
I was taking a college, it was a prep course. I was in honors English. I was in honors classes in high school, and then once I hit senior year, they opened up kind of like this prep college course that one of the teachers, one of the regular teachers, not one of the nuns, Mrs. Quigley, and who now is Dr. Quigley, but she was actually getting her PhD at the time, and she was teaching the college level course, and we had this kind of anthology that I still have, and in the anthology, obviously, it's like short stories, plays, and poetry. And I stumbled upon this poem by Dorothy Parker called Indian Summer. And I know it sounds weird, but I read that and it just completely opened poetry for me.
So prior to that, you had not encountered poetry in a way that struck you?
No. It was usually fiction. Like I said, it was fiction stuff that I was reading, honestly, primarily. I did write my first poem in 7th grade, though. That was a memory I sort of like forgot about and remembered in the last few years. I did write a poem in 7th grade called Push, and it won the contest in the class, which is a class contest. So that was like technically my first poem, but I was writing like little short stories the entire time more than anything else. So the poetry thing didn't really like kick off for me
So
till later.
after you encountered
Dorothy Parker.
That led to just in seeking out other lineated pieces of writing, or?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Parker, the reason she stood out is that anybody that reads Indian Summer, it's a very short poem. It's only 8 lines, 2 stanzas, and they rhyme and things like that. But it was the power of the poem. It's, one of the lines, I'm going to paraphrase, says, "If you do not like me so, then to hell my love with you." And I thought this was the most revolutionary thing I've ever. Well, first of all, it was a Catholic school. And here I am reading a poem with the book Hell in it. And I swore that Mrs. Quigley was going to get fired. I was like, oh my God, she's going to get fired for this. She's teaching us this. And we learned other things too that I think at the time where she was pushing those boundaries of what a Catholic school, probably could teach. And, but the poem just was like, had this wit and the strength. And here was a woman saying, well, if you don't like me the way I am, then to hell with you. Like, I don't have to, like, I'm not going to bend for you. I'm not going to morph into what you want me to become. And that really, at 16, 17 years old, that really, like, struck me as a young woman. And I was like, wow, so poetry can be funny. Poetry can be smart. It can be, and it can be strong, and women can do this. That was like a big deal, because it was only men for the most part in the anthology and this one, and there were other women too, but it was Dorothy Parker's that one, and that really opened the door for me to that poetry had more than what I assumed.
And by the time you encountered that poem, did you already have your sights set on college?
I did, and I was definitely going to go to college. There was no question about that in my household. Nobody in my family had gone to college, so I'm the first one to actually go and graduate. And so my mother, had to drop out when she was pregnant with me, so she never finished her time at her school. And then my biological father never even matriculated, never even entertained it. He went to a trade school. So again, no one in my family had was never college bound, and so I was it, and there was an opportunity there, and I did well in high school. I got really good grades. I got money to go to Cornell and to Georgetown, and I got into NYU. I had some options, and the financial opportunities were there as well. But Cornell was the one that really came through the most, and for everybody agreed. I was like, okay, that's where, and I really liked it. I enjoyed my visit there, and
Ithaca, right?
Ithaca,
Yeah.
and it was in New York, but it was upstate New York. So my mom, in her mind, she was like, okay, you're still within the state. She wasn't really keen about Georgetown because it was out of state, even though it's still the same distance.
Yeah.
It's still five hours away from each other, but it wasn't until Cornell, honestly, that I was introduced to Latino poets. And I can give Elena Viramontes all the credit for that.
But when you got to Cornell, did you already know what your major was going to be?
Yeah, I was really dead set on being a government major because I was going to go to law school. So I was like 16 or 17, and I already had like this 10-year plan. I was like, oh, I'm gonna go to, I'm gonna go to college, be a government major, then I'm gonna go to law school, then I'm gonna, obviously, pass the bar, and then I'm gonna go into, like, I had it all laid out.
And what happened?
Honestly, poetry happened. That really not derailed, but really just changed the trajectory of what I wanted to do, for sure.
So poetry, but you were introduced by poetry by Elena Maria Viramontes, who's a fiction writer. So did she detect something in you that said, oh, poet, not fiction writer?
Well, it happened before. I took an intro to creative writing my sophomore first semester sophomore year. I started to take English courses, obviously freshman year, and something triggered there. I took a pulp fiction class with this professor, and we read Dracula and we read this other stuff. And I was really enjoying the workshop discussions we were having about these texts. And I just found it, and I discovered a loophole. That's when I started to shift my, that's when I was like, maybe I'll change majors. Because I realized that to be an English major, you can have these discussions, and like I can have my ideas of Dracula, you can have your ideas about Dracula, and we both can technically be right, right? It just depends on the evidence that we provide. And that's when I realized, again, I was like 18 years old, and I was like, wait a minute, this is like the easiest, like I love this. Everybody can be right. It just depends on the economics of your language and the quality of your evidence. I like this. This is nice. I like the fact that there wasn't so black and white. Let's say like in math, if you were going to be a mathematician, or in science, where it was a bit more like rigid, I felt at the time. So I started to think about shifting majors, even as early as freshman year. But then that first semester, sophomore year, I took this intro to creative writing. Someone told me it was an easy A. What college student does not want an easy A? So I said, I'll do it. Let me take it. I was taking some other hard courses. I needed a balance.
Yeah.
And I took this course, and I had to write fiction as well as poetry. And once the course was over, I met with this graduate student, and she's looking over my portfolio, and I said, I really like this. I really dug this class. I mean, the next level would have to be a 200-level class, but I have to decide. There's no more intros. It's either fiction or poetry. What is your opinion here? And she said, I think you have something here with the poetry. I think there's something here. I think you should take a class. And so I said, okay. I took her advice, was in another course, and I really liked that. I still have the books from that class. And then I took a class with Elena my junior year. And by sophomore year, sophomore year, I definitively decided I was changing majors.
Okay.
And I said, nope, I'm going to shift gears here and declare English as my major. And I asked Elena to be my advisor.
You had already encountered her before.
I had encountered her. There's not too many Latino, at the time there was not too many Latino professors. And she was there, obviously. And I had asked her if I could take, she could be my advisor and guide me. And she said, yeah, absolutely. And she was then teaching a kind of a survey course on Latino literature, on U.S. Latino literature.
What year would this be?
Oh, this must have been, it was definitely mid-90s. I want to say 97.
So mid-90s, you were taking a survey course on Latino literature taught by Elena Maria Viramontes. And that class was a revelation?
It was absolutely revelatory. Between that and another U.S. Latino, learning about U.S. Latino politics with another professor that same year really just was revelatory. And it was a game changer because Elena had us read novels, short stories, and we had like a reader, like a packet of different poems that she kind of pieced together. That's where I met the work of Willie Perdomo.
Yeah, who else?
And that's really, but that was the class that I met Martín Espada. And it was his poems that really that pushed me over the edge. Martín's work, and again, he's a Puerto Rican poet from Brooklyn. And I'm reading his work, and it was and the book was Rebellion is in the Circle of a Lover's Hand. And I'm reading his book, and here he's talking about Brooklyn, he's talking about New York City, and he's talking about Puerto Rico. He's using words like pegao and, cuchifrito, and he's using these words that I knew growing up. And his poems just felt like home. And I never, to that day, I never knew that Puerto Rican poets really existed. And we read also Jesus Colón's work in that class. And I just was so ignorant, and this is why now as a teacher, I'm so intentional about introducing my students to different people, because I want them to see themselves in their work. I mean, I want their experiences hopefully in literature, because it was wonderful that at the age of 19 or 18, whatever, 19 years old, that I finally was exposed to this. But I always imagine what would have been my life like if I was exposed to this at 12 or 11, and had, I just felt it was kind of late to be introduced to it, but I'm really grateful.
And how did that experience translate into the desire to want to pursue graduate work in creative writing?
Well, that class...
Which is quite a leap.
Yeah, it was. That class was just, like I said, it was a game changer, and Elena had us write in that class, right? I mean, she's a writer herself, right? So she had us write, poems or whatever we wanted, and I was rereading.
So it was a literature class, but she had the students have their hand in writing.
Yeah, she was very, I love Elena for that. She's such a flexible educator. She wasn't really trying to put us in any boxes. She just was trying to introduce us to different people, some people that she knew personally, like Julia Alvarez, and just kind of let us be and exist with the work and see what happened. And for me, reading, Willie's work and then Martín's work specifically, and then also reading Pedro Pietri's work, and then even being introduced to New York Poets Cafe, like what that was like, that movement, was a big deal as a junior. It was early junior year, and I started writing. And I was like, okay, I like this. And then I was sharing work with friends. I was going to open mics on campus. And then Elena decided that she was going to do a 300 level class, or like 300 level class or a 400 level class. She was going to create it. She was going to create this course that was going to be specifically creative writing. And because she knew so many of us like this. She knew me, she knew other people who were undergrads and were really thirsty for creative writing classes, but they didn't really offer them at Cornell, not at that level, and not specifically for students of color. We had different stories to tell, and she knew that. So she created a class that was meant for, I like to say, this motley crew of kids who were writing in isolation, and she wanted us to give, the way I see it, she wanted us to give us a formal space to really cultivate this craft. So I took this course with poets and fiction writers and nonfiction writers. So
it was a multi-genre
course. It was,
yeah.
She made it into this hodgepodge of a class, right? And she said that. She's like, this is for you. She created that for us because she knew so many of us in that room. And so she did this only once. I don't know if she did it ever again, but she didn't do it again the next year.
That was your junior year?
Yeah, it was my junior year, and like the second semester junior year. And that's where I got a chance to really, she put on her workshop hat in that semester, right? And so we brought in stuff and we had to get it workshopped, and then people came in and said, well, what about this? Take that out. And it was like kind of being like in an MFA program, but not really. And that was it. Like that class just cemented it for me.
Cemented what?
That I wanted to do this.
Meaning what?
I wanted to be a poet.
Okay.
I wanted to be a poet after that class. And I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to do this. But I was on a path of being a lawyer, and I told my family that this was what I was going to do. And I think when you're first generation, there is a huge, you're not just graduating for yourself, you're graduating with 10, 15 other people. And there was a lot of pressure. And I couldn't give it up. And then senior year came around, and I prepared for the LSATs. I took the LSATs. I was looking at law schools. I was applying to law schools. I did apply to law schools. But as that was happening, I was having conversations with Latinas who were lawyers and who I knew were in law school or already had graduated, and who knew me as a person and as a creative person. And we were having these intimate conversations, and they all kind of agreed. They were like, you don't want to do this. You don't want to be a lawyer. Trust me, you don't. It's really awful. They didn't even like it. And they were like, you're a creative person. If you do this, that part is going to die. Like, that will get extinguished. You really shouldn't. And that happened in multiple conversations with different Latinas who were in this in the legal space. And that kind of lingered. My future husband I was dating him at the time, and we were in the library getting some books for a research paper that he was doing, and I was doing something, a Shakespeare class I was taking at the time, and we were talking about our futures. And I was about to graduate in a few months. It was second semester, senior year, and I'd never forget it. We were in the stacks, and he goes, if you could just have your druthers, if you could just choose what you want to do right now, forget this, forget that, what would you do? And I said, if I could, I would just write. I would be a poet, and I just want to write and maybe teach, if I had it my way. Yeah. But I don't think I have it my way. I really can't, like, you know what I mean? Like, at the time, I was like, I just can't make that independent decision. I feel selfish. I already promised so many things, and I feel like I got to take care of so many people once all this, again, there was a plan. And he was just like, no, that's what you want to do. And I had to really come to a moment. And so I decided, the timing was awful. I always tell people, don't ever do this. I told my mother on graduation day that I was not going to be a lawyer. On graduation day, here she is. She drove up. She's there. Nobody else could come to no, I think my grandmother was there too, maybe. And I remember telling her, my mom specifically, after all this time, right, all these promises.
But did you have what was your plan B?
What was my plan B? My plan B, which was not a great plan B, I was like, I'm going to get a job. I told her, I'm going to get a job. I'll move back to New York with you, and I need a year to work on my portfolio.
For graduate school.
Right, because I knew somebody who was at Emerson. I had a friend of mine who was at Emerson for fiction, and she was already 1 year in, and she goes, listen, you're going to have to take the GREs, you're going to need a portfolio, this is what you need to do.
So by then, you already were exposed to the idea of an MFA in creative writing, and that was through Elena?
It was Elena, but also I had, contemporary people, like friends who were, like I said, my friend Eva Liz Rodriguez, who has a book out, and through Feminist Press. So she was in her first year of Emerson, and we and her were really good friends. Okay. And she said to me, it's like, she was another person too. It goes, oh, Luivette, you're meant to be a writer. You're not meant to be a lawyer. You're meant to be writing. And
so it sounds like you had some mentors who were close to your age in writing.
I did. I had a lot of support who were just nudging me in that direction. And I made that decision that I wanted to write, and I needed a year to get this portfolio together. And I told my mom, give me a year. I'll promise I'm going to go back to school. She was just really nervous that I was never going to go back to school. She was just more like, no, you're going to get used to the money. Te vas a acostumbrar el dinero. You're going to get used to the money, that whatever money you're going to be making in the real world, and you're not going to go back.
Meaning back to law school?
Like, just back to school. Okay. Like, she was just really like, you're not going to go back.
So she was skeptical that you were actually going to go to an MFA program.
Or anything. Well, she was upset that I wasn't going to law school. Like, that was definitive. Like, that was an unfortunate argument, right? But then me pushing back, going, no, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go to MFA school, watch. And for her, MFA has held no meaning.
Yeah, what does that mean?
What does that mean? For that generation of Latinos.
They understood law school, medical school.
Maybe business. Maybe business. But it was law school or medical school. Yeah. And they knew medical school was not going to happen for me. So that was it. And that was the profession that I was supposed to have. And I was going to help them, eventually. And so here I am talking about MFA school, which there's no connection for her there. I told her I want to be a writer, which for her, she was like, what? Like, I had never really shared my poetry with her. So there was she had no idea where this is coming from. And I told her, no, I'm going to get a job in New York and at a nonprofit in education.
Yeah.
And I did. I actually landed a job and I got it. But the situation with my mom just was really unfortunate. It was very, it just was non-supportive environment. So I had to just, but I did take my year. I did do exactly what I said I was going to do. Mm-hmm. And I got, I worked on a portfolio, I took the GREs, and I applied to a few MFA programs.
Let's transition now. I want to sort of leapfrog. Okay, so you do the MFA, and here's why I'm posing this question. In my observations, many people do MFAs, and then they complete their MFA, and then they stop writing, and they never publish a book. Mm-hmm. So talk to us about your journey. Okay, you have an MFA in hand, so you can check that box. Now, of course, the next is, okay, now what? Share with us how the journey from minted MFA degree holder to author of this book.
So that particular book, the first one, Unfinished Portrait, a good chunk of it was my thesis from MFA, from UMass Amherst. About 90% of the poems are from the MFA, from that MFA program.
How much time transpired, just to give a sense of time here, how much time transpired from the time you completed your MFA to the publication of this book?
MFA, I was done in 2003, May 20 of 2003. And then that came out in November of 2008.
So 5 years.
It was a 5-year process.
What was happening in those 5 years?
What was happening in those 5 years was 3 children. In those 5 years, I had 3 kids. So that takes up a lot of your time.
Yeah.
And so in that time, I moved from Massachusetts to Los Angeles. That was it, right? Like literally graduated in May. I was in Los Angeles by August, and had my first child a year later, like in 2004. Then I had the second one in 2006, and the third one was 2008.
In the meantime, are you teaching?
I was actually teaching adjunct. I was adjuncting at a community college, like right across the street from my home. I first started working at a library. Actually, when I first got to LA, and I had no kids, it was a library, Azusa Public Library. I worked there as a literacy coordinator, and I did that for a while. But then having the kids, I wanted to be home, right, while their dad worked the 9 to 5. But I liked the classroom, so I was able to adjunct in the evening across the street, literally across the street, and then, be home with the kids in the daytime, and that gave me flexibility. And somewhere, whenever they were asleep, I would write. And then I put this together, and then it took I sent this to Luis Rodriguez in 2006, I want to say, and it took 2 years before people finally saw it.
I want to transition now. I'm pinch hitting here for Sofia Villamil, and I want to read to you a question that she wanted to pose to you, which is relevant to our recent discussion. She says, another essential aspect of your journey, besides your youth and roots, is the fact that you are a mother. You've said that you continue writing poetry because of your kids and for your kids, and that you even coincidentally, or maybe not, have 3 kids and 3 poetry collections. I want to ask you about how motherhood has shaped the way you write, create, and view the world.
Well, the writing part, when they were little, it was difficult. I don't have you get asked the question a lot as a writer, like, well, what's your ritual? Like, what's your process? And I didn't have a process. I would write whenever they were napping. Really, it's like if they napped at 2:00 in the afternoon, and I wasn't physically exhausted, then maybe that's when I decided to write. So I didn't really have a set time because of being a mom and them being so little, and there was one after the other, and trying to be a teacher too. It was a lot. So the writing and motherhood, it made me. I think it forced me to be forgiving. Right? Where I'm like, I felt a lot of pressure and I felt guilty when people would ask that question about what was my process. And all these other writers said, well, I wake up at 4 a.m. and I do this. And I'm like, wow, I can't do that, right? Judith Ortiz-Cofer had that process that she would wake up at 5 a.m. She has a whole essay about that. I tried to do that. that failed miserably for me. I was exhausted. I was like, I can't do what Judith Ortiz Cofer does. That's what works for Judith Ortiz Cofer.
Yeah.
And I had to be more forgiving and find out what works for me. So I think motherhood really helped me develop my own writing, routine and process. But for me, being a mom, how it just completely changed me in my writing is that I really do dedicate all the books to them. And even that was intentional with the first one, because I knew I was going to have more. The dedication was actually done before the third one was born. But I want my kids to know that there's options in the world. I grew up in a home that was very traditional. And as we just talked about, where there was either you're a doctor or you're a lawyer, now maybe business. But anything in between, are you allowed to explore? I wasn't really allowed to explore. There was some hesitancy there. There was friction there. There was tension because I wanted to be a writer. I was intentional with this. I was like, I want my kids to know that there's options in the world. That if they wanted to be artists, if they wanted to be a writer or anything creative, that they could. And did it have to be a profession? Maybe, maybe not. But that was so important to me. And so since they were little, my kids were going with me to poetry readings, museums. They were surrounded by artists, of all different musicians. And now that, as you know, my oldest is 19 and he's an art history, he wants to be an art history major. And he wants to be a journalist. And I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that's an accident. I think that's by the exposure that he had as a child. And even my youngest is as well, really has an affinity for writing and really a love for, he has Ada Limon's latest book completely by choice. He really fell in love with some of her work when he was taking a class last year. And then he came home to me, he's like, hey, I like this woman named Ada. I'm like, Ada Limon? And he's like, yeah. Can you get me her latest book? And I bought him a book for Christmas, and he was reading it completely on his own, and he was 14. So I think this is the reason I do this, is that not only is it, they're my legacy, definitely, and how they act in the world. That's my legacy as well. But this is also my legacy. And I want both of my legacies to coexist.
You have 3 incredible, insightful, bold collections: Unfinished Portrait, Ascension, and Living on Islands Not Found on Maps. How do you see the trajectory of your life and your progress as a writer expressed in these texts?
So the first one, because it was written when I was in MFA school, when I reread it, I hear the anger. I hear the angsty, graduate student, because it was a rough time. MFA was not rainbows and unicorns. It was a rough time. I was the only Latina in my year. I was the only person of color in my year, and so I didn't feel welcomed, by the majority of my classmates. The faculty were also, again, had a very certain aesthetic of what kind of poets they were trying to produce in New England. And I almost dropped out. My first year, I was like, I gotta go. I can't do this. This is too much. At least at Cornell, I had my people. I had a group of people that I had established friendships with, with Black, Latino, Asian American students, and we had a nice little alliance and community. And here, I was in Amherst, and now the classes are getting smaller and smaller, and it was harder to find people that look like me. And so I was almost out. I really was like, I just don't. And the professors there were not Elena, right? That welcoming, and it was hard. Emotionally, it was difficult. It was 22 or something like that.
So what happened? What you stayed?
Martin
Espada.
Martin, I really credit Martin. Martin Espada teaches at UMass Amherst in the English department, not the creative writing department. But he and I obviously met, and I took a lot of independent study courses with him intentionally, because that's how I was able to kind of manipulate it. And I took a lot of courses with him that I created or that he created for some of the graduate students who were thirsty for something different. And my friendship with him and being mentored by him those 3 years, I give him all the credit.
And so that's that sort of manifested in book one. What about book two?
So there's a lot of anger in book one. I will say that. Book two, Ascension, ironically enough, even though it says Ascension, my marriage was falling apart. My relationship, there was a dissolution happening. Even Luis Rodriguez will say that. When I sent him that manuscript, he was reading it and his wife was right next to him. And he told me later, like when he was reading it, he was like, something's going on. Something's going on. Like, he's like, it's all in here. So he read my work and he was able to read between the lines and he knew me already at that point. And he goes, I read the poems and I didn't need for you to tell me because the poems were telling me. Mm. So Ascension, ironically enough, was was focusing on that very life-changing time in my life. Mm-hmm. And then Living on Islands, Not Find on Maps, that one was, I feel like that one really was where I started focusing more about my family. Mm-hmm. It was when the poems about my upbringing and childhood, that's when I was willing to go there. And there's more poems, too, about my children in this one, right? Like
in the third one.
In the third one. I was not comfortable talking about the kids in the other books, but the third one I felt more, okay, I can write about them and I can write about them and share those moments. And it's their lives, too. So it's like, okay, I have to be okay with sharing their stuff, too. And they're fine with it. But I think the third book was definitely more me willing to talk about my childhood, and really there's some things in there that again are pretty intense, and I knew exactly what I was doing, but it took me a while to get there.
On that note, would you be willing to read a poem from this book?
Mm-hmm.
and talk about
Sure.
the genesis of it?
Sure. Which one?
The one on the left.
The nomenclature?
Yeah.
Okay. Carmen is her name when I flash back to red handprints on my thighs for dropping a plate of rice and beans. It was Carmen's hair I pulled back over toilet bowls. Carmen's body I laid to sleep. Mama wiped tears off my 4-year-old face when the number 42 bus never showed during a blizzard, and I had to miss kindergarten for the first time. Luis is his name when asked, where does your father live? And like a press secretary, I reply, he chose to stay on the island. His decision become confessions as we overlook the foliage of El Yunque. I see my face in his, silently hoping it's the only thing we share. Papa would have followed me like a character in a Tolkien novel, but Luis chose the women in Basilón over me. Joseph is his name when I talk about his wife and other life across the George Washington Bridge. Joseph when my children and I are shooed away because how does he explain 3 brown nietos to white coworkers? Dad is the stepfather who called me baby bear on Sunday morning phone calls, danced with me at my sweet 16, and gave me away at the altar. Pseudonyms detach them from the people they are and the people I need them to be. So that's, I think, a great example of poems that I wrote that took me a while to be able to write, because so much of that particular poem stems from reality, and then being able to put those things onto the page. And then obviously share that with the world. That was a major, to me, it was a big leap. It was a big step I was taking. But poetry is a way to reconcile so many of these memories for me. And really just, I think one of the things I'm learning now as I'm older and as a parent is that our parents are also fallible, and they're flawed people, and they had a different life before they met us. And it's a different generation, right? So, when they were growing up, the resources that we have now are so drastically different. Like we have so many self-help books, and there's so many podcasts, and there's so many outlets for us to really make sense of our feelings and things like that. My mom's generation didn't really have that. That's just not something you did. Tú no hablabas de esas cosas, right? You didn't talk about your feelings. You didn't. You kind of brush things under the rug, or you just kept those things to the side. So again, that particular book was a lot, because I was like, okay, I'm reconciling with these 3 people in particular, my parents, their mama and their papa and their dad, but they're also Carmen, they're also Joseph, they're also Luis. real people who made real mistakes, and now just me coming to terms with it and showing them some grace and compassion, because I know now as a parent I've made more than my fair share of mistakes. So now just really coming to terms with all that poetically.
And how has it been reading from this book for live audiences? What kind of reception have you been getting for some of the poems that we would perhaps describe as more vulnerable and more putting information out there that you perhaps had to navigate and decide whether you wanted to or not? What's that experience been like?
The reception has been really positive. That particular poem gets a lot of people. I'll get emails, or maybe someone on the side will talk to me and said, I get that, I've been there, or I have a similar situation. Or the poem I have there about the CVS letter gets really, usually a lot of people like that one too. And that's also being vulnerable. The CVS one is very vulnerable. And so I think the reception has been extremely positive, and what I get from all audience members, it doesn't matter who they are, is kind of like they appreciate that I'm putting myself out there, that I'm making myself vulnerable, because that gives them permission then to kind of reciprocate that vulnerability, like after I'm done reading. Like, again, it's in private, it's not like out there in the world. Sometimes during the Q&A, people will just share for everybody else to hear, and that's great. But most of the time it's one-on-one, or over email, or if it's a class, it'll be written in a note, and I save everything. I don't throw any of those notes away, and I save all those little things, and the reception has been more like thank you, or I had a similar experience, and then they go from there.
Here's another question by Sophia. A poem that really stood out to me from this collection was The Lost Episode of Diana Prince. Now, you're a huge Wonder Woman, also known as Diana Prince, fan, and I was wondering what this poem means to you personally, and whether you felt you were rewriting or reclaiming her story through this poem, or simply revealing something that was already there about her experience as a woman.
I am a huge Wonder Woman fan. Go Linda Carter. No disrespect to Gal Gadot, but seriously, Linda Carter by far is going to be the one and only Wonder Woman in my eyes. I nerded out a little bit and found out that there was only 60 episodes of Wonder Woman.
With Linda Carter.
Right, with Linda Carter. 60 including the pilot. And that was it. It was like 2 seasons or something, and which is weird because you would think, in my memory, there was a lot more, but it was really technically only 2 seasons. And a couple of things to answer her question. My tia's name is Diana, okay, the one who passed away, unfortunately. So my tia's name is Diana. Linda Carter who is half Mexicana. She's Mexicana, so again, you have a Latina superhero, which, again, at the time I didn't know when I was little, but when I got older, I was like, oh, even better. This is amazing. And Nikki Giovanni has a great poem called Wonder Woman. It has a reference to Wonder Woman, or not the superhero, but Wonder Woman, just the name. So there was a lot of things for me that were just lining up to write that poem, and I wanted to take Wonder Woman, and all the things about her that we know, her lasso, and really kind of strip her down a little bit, because I think that one of the things that women, I think, get is a lot of women get the term, oh, you're such a strong woman, you're so resilient. And I know lately I've just been more I'm really starting to resent that that compliment that's supposed to be a compliment. I know it is a compliment, but I'm starting to kind of resent it a little bit, because I'm really tired of being resilient. There's an exhaustion of always having to show up and be strong. I think a lot of people don't notice that. It's really hard, and after a while you're just so done, and you just want to crumble. Someone said it really well, and I was watching it recently. She said, I want to be fragile. Because when you see the word fragile written on anything, you handle it with care. I want to be handled with care. And that resonated with me. And so again, that poem, it's let's take, in my mind, I was what happens to Wonder Woman, when she comes home? The things that people don't see about her. They only know her as, kicking ass and saving people. That's what they know. But what about the other side of it? And she was always saving Steve, right? Steve was always in trouble. And again, it's like, and it's a metaphor too, like how many times women have had to save men, either literally or figuratively, right? And it's like, she's exhausted, and I wanted to write a poem where we can get to see that exhaustion and that softer side of her that, again, she's always having to put this facade, right? She's again so impervious to people. Like, no, but guess what? She has to decide how is the word wonder really going to show up really today. And she's allowed to be soft, and she's allowed to crumble, and she's allowed to maybe drink too much too. Like everyone has their days, and I wanted to give Wonder Woman her days too, and that she doesn't always have to show up and save the day.
Before we get to our last question, let me ask you this one.
Mm-hmm.
Let me preface this by saying that one of the things that Sophia and I did, well, Sophia more than I just showed up. She curated a group of 10 students, and we read a selection of your poems and a selection of Fred's poems, and then we met for dinner about a week ago. They'll probably be at the event tonight to discuss your poems. That's the preface to this question. One other poem that resonated so much with me and with our Letras Latinas discussion group was Perfect Attendance. During our discussion, I talked about how I felt like it was one of the most beautiful and striking ways I've seen something called sonder, which is the realization that every person is living a life as vivid and complex as your own, described. Another student believed it to be more of a testament to the fact that, despite sharing a classroom, students sometimes don't speak to each other or learn about each other's lives and circumstances as much as they should. What do you think of these possibilities? Does your experience as an educator speak to either?
Yeah, the last part for sure about students don't talk to each other. And Perfect Attendance came from teaching community college for so long. I taught university level too. So, I taught, I think, probably for almost 12 years, right? I did this and at different colleges. But what I noticed is that it was the same thing happening every single year, where I was, you go through the roster, you say the names, and basically a lot of the names were changed just to save some people's, just keep it anonymous. But a lot of those the stanzas were coming from real experiences, from things that people shared with me, students. But I agree, the students don't know each other. They're in these classes for 15 weeks, whatever, 12 weeks, 16 weeks. And unless they have to be in a lab or something and they have to collaborate, they really kind of sit by themselves. I noticed students always kind of had their own little pockets, and they had their own seat every single week. I only taught like once a week. And then every so often they would share stuff with each other in class discussions if the literature really kind of brought it out in them. But I would get these stories. Like, they felt more comfortable talking to me one-on-one, and it was just like, wow, we don't know each other's stories. We don't know we don't know what's coming through the door. As an educator, I gave so much respect to my students, right, for showing up, especially I would say the community college kids, because many of them were showing up, paying for their own education, paying for their own books, paying for the tuition, and managing a full-time job, or managing also like a family, but the range was so different, right? I had the 18-year-old and I had a 60-year-old in the same class. And it was incredible. It was beautiful to see, but I think Perfect Attendance was really, for me, it was a way to kind of, immortalize these students who were showing up day in and day out, very determined for their own, they had their own goals, their own reasons for being there. And nobody really knew each other. Nobody really knew each other's stories. And, but again, I did a little bit. And sometimes, like I said, there was one gentleman who was very open and said, because right after 9/11, he said nobody would sit next to him at the lunch table when he was in high school, because he was wearing a pugri. And it was right after 9/11, he said, and so he sat by himself. And everybody in the class, in the writing class, was like, wow, that sounds so wrong. He's like, yeah, they thought that I was a terrorist, they thought I was this. And he's like, I'm a skateboarder, like, from the valley. Like, that's what I'm doing on the weekends. And and everybody kind of laughed, and when we started having a conversation of assumptions that we make of people when we see them, when they walk through the door, when they're sitting at the table, when they're sitting in their seats, and it was a very eye-opening discussion, and that also kind of went into the writing of that particular poem.
Okay. To wind down, my final question is to ask you to give advice to these students who are witnessing this interview, who themselves are taking a poetry writing workshop, some of them for the first time. What advice do you have to a college student who finds himself in a creative writing workshop because they want to move outside their comfort zone perhaps, or they want to fulfill a requirement, or whatever their reasons are? What advice would you give them?
I think for me, what's really stood out for me the last few years as a writer is to establish your community. Like, get a community, right? I mean, those people that you're taking a writing class with, they could be your future readers later down the line. You develop a level of trust in these workshops with people because you're bringing in poems that could be very vulnerable potentially, or vice versa. So, right, it's not just you, but someone's trusting you with their work. And I think in those spaces, you could be sitting next to someone who you'll know for the next 20 years, right? And it could be someone who you're going to trust your work with, and vice versa. So I think that, starting off poetry, if you're going to do this, right, whether you're going to do it as a vocation or just, something on top of what else do you want to do, not only do you want to just keep writing, obviously, or find whatever process is going to work for you. I think process is individual. I don't really try to tell people to do a certain thing. Yeah. You have to write by 5 or no. I think that's very personal and intimate. Whatever works for you is, like Carlos Cumpiang, I think, mentioned one time that I think he writes like using Excel spreadsheets or something. It was just so wild, and I was like, I am never going to do that. But that works for him, right? So everyone has their own way of writing, and you got to respect that. So definitely find what works for you, what rituals work for you. But I think what has saved me, at least the last few years, is having a community. I mean, I know that we write in isolation, right? That writing is you write in isolation. That's what we usually do. But I think that the after you write in isolation, the very natural thing to do is share that work. Now, who do you share that work with? That initial hot off the press poem. It's going to be someone from that community, right? Someone that you trust, who's going to give you honest feedback and constructive feedback, and that you trust, and that who cares about your work as much as you do, hopefully, and vice versa. So I would say that you're in this workshop, make the friends, find your people, and really foster those connections, because you just really never know. Those will be the people that you're friends with, again, for 15, 20 years. Again, I see that in my life. Still having those same friendships from graduate school with Martin, Yago Cura.
Oh, you know Yago Cura?
Yeah, yeah, he was a year above me. Oh, okay. So Yago and I have been friends for 20 years, and now he's in LA. Yeah. So, I mean, again, one of the reasons I never say no to Yago. Yago will call me or text me and say, hey, can you do this reading? Unless I have another commitment, I say yes. And the reason I'm saying yes is because he was in my workshops. That's my.
What part of Southern California does he live in now?
He lives in Torrance.
Oh, okay.
He's out in Torrance.
I just know him through correspondence, yeah.
Yeah, he's in Torrance now. He's out there, and fabulous librarian, champion of books and literacy, but still también a poeta.
He was in your MFA program?
He was so I was in year 1, he was in year 2. So he was a year above me. But he also had a similar experience. Like when we met and we kind of became friends, we realized like, oh, wow. So I said, I am the Latina representative for the first year, and he was the Latino representative in the second year. Like we realized there was only one of us every year. And then we befriended, he came together with me to make friends with Martin, and because we were really, it was myself, Yago, and a couple of other students who were really hungry for more than what the MFA program was offering. We were looking to take classes with Martin, and anyway, and do other stuff.
So that experience is what really cemented this advice you're giving now.
Yeah.
To take advantage of the people who are sitting next to you. Absolutely. As a resource.
Absolutely. You just never know. Like, again, in 2002, 2001, when I started MFA school, I had no idea. Yago, who I used to take the bus with, because that's how I knew him, he was there taking the bus with me, sitting somewhere else. And then I would see him in class a couple hours later going like, oh, it's the guy from the bus, and next thing you know, fast forward to, 2-3 years later, we're hanging out, having drinks and sharing poems. And now I just saw him over the summer where I got to meet his kids again. I mean, I know his wife and he knows my boys and he knows my daughter too. So it's like, who knew? And we always kind of laugh at it. Every time people look at each other, like, how do you guys know each other? We laugh. We're like, oh my God, I've known her, I've known him. And, for 20-something years. And that connection, and I respect his work. He's an amazing editor. So I say in these moments when you're in these classes, don't be afraid to reach out and keep those relationships. If you connect with someone, don't let it go. We have so many ways to keep in touch with each other these days. Technology is amazing in that way. Keep in touch with each other. Email, text, lo que sea. And you just really have no idea who you're sitting next to, who's going to be a lifelong editor and who's going to be able to help you. I mean, I got so much help with this last collection. There was at least 5 or 6 people who saw this before anybody else did. There were 7 different versions of this book. And it was because 7 or so different people looked at this and said, take this out, move this over here. And they were community. They were part of my community that I met at either CantoMundo or they were, again, from MFA school or from now in LA. So, community, por favor.
On that note, thank you for spending this time with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.